We've been telling y'all about how Republicans are doing everything they can to make it harder to vote. There are several cases across the country we have our eyes on this week. In Michigan, the federal trial will determine the legality of the state's 2-year-old voting district maps. The outcome could upend Metro Detroit voting boundaries and cause a political scramble among incumbent lawmakers in 2024. A 3-judge federal panel will hear arguments in Kalamazoo over whether the architects of the state House and Senate voting districts used in the November 2022 election diluted the black vote by drawing districts that stretch segments of the majority black city of Detroit into majority white suburbs. Today was the deadline for the Arkansas Secretary of State to submit and respond to a brief in the U.S. Supreme Court in the case challenging Arkansas's congressional map. At issue, the state's map intentionally cracks black voters across multiple congressional districts to dilute their voting strength in violation of the U.S. and Arkansas constitutions. For the U.S., Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The plaintiff specifically alleged that black voters in Pulaski County, home of Little Rock, were divided among 3 congressional districts rather than keeping the population in one district, the 2nd Congressional District, to discourage the incentive of the black voters of the areas to vote and to reduce the significance of their votes. Friday, the Kansas Supreme Court will hear arguments over whether a legal challenge against 2 voter suppression laws may proceed. The case claims the laws that criminalize individuals for giving voter assistance, limit ballot collection, restrict advocacy organizations from helping voters, impose a signature verification requirement, and that violates the Kansas Constitution by unduly burdening Kansans and their right to vote. Let's talk about it with my panel, Robert Portillo. He hosts of People, Passion, Politics, News and Talk 1380, WALK out of Atlanta. Rebecca Carruthers, Vice President, Fair Election Center out of D.C. Bottom line here, Rebecca, this is the type of stuff that we have seen from Republicans because it is all designed. It is all designed to target and minimize the power of black people.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would say anywhere where there's a sizable black population in this country, we need to actually review some of those districts. Unless you are in a state which allows for a nonpartisan commission to draw legislative maps, right now, our system with the very weekend VRA, Voting Rights Act, is our system is under attack. And we specifically see black communities targeted. We do see some Latino, some Hispanic communities targeted, but because black folks have an outsized turnout that supports one particular party, we see that black specific areas are very much aggressively targeted. And it's not just dealing with legislative seats, but it's also even dealing with census tracts, with determining what resources get to certain areas. But I repeat, black communities are under attack in this country.
You know, Robert, you talk about, again, Kansas, Arkansas, and even in Michigan. In Michigan, the problem there was the voters there approved a ballot initiative establishing a commission to draw lines, but here's the problem. When you still have political folks in charge, they are going to try to get their advantage. We saw in Ohio where they flat out, Republicans there, flat out just ignored the commission and said, we're going to do what's right for us.
We have to understand, remember for the last 30 years or so when Republicans have been trying to tell us that there's no such thing as voter suppression? The whole time they were doing voter suppression in the background. That's why they were telling you it didn't exist. And this is a perfect example of it, that they have been able to use the redistricting system in order to gain unfair political advantage. When we talk about Republicans over the course of the last 15 years or so, taking over 26 houses of legislature across the country, controlling those state and local ballots, that means that in 2010 and 2020, they were able to increasingly draw these gerrymandered districts to either A, pack African Americans together, thereby limiting the number of representatives they should have within the Congress or also within the state legislative bodies, or B, cracking those districts, taking a majority black district and cracking it directly down the middle and then splitting it in, let's say, 2 to 4 ways, diluting the vote power of those groups, therefore additionally depriving us of seats in our elected bodies of representation. Understand Republicans have not won the popular vote since 2004 in a national election. That's the only time they've won since 1988 in a national election. So in the last 35 years, they won the popular vote a grand total of 2 times. They are not trying to be a majority party. The 51 Democratic senators versus the 49 Republican senators, the 51 Democratic senators represent about 41 million more people than those 49 Republican senators do. We see similar numbers in the House of Representatives. They know that they have to go vote for vote. They cannot win. Therefore, they have to play the referees. They have to change the lines. When the courts were ruling on the North Carolina lines several years ago, they said those lines were drawn with laser-like precision in order to disenfranchise black voters. And this is not one of those sexy issues that sounds good on a T-shirt or on a slogan or on a yard sign or something along those lines. But we need to understand this is the most important issue, because if they're able to change your representation, then that means they can effectively nullify your vote. That means that we have to vote in outsized numbers. We have to turn out at 2 to 3 times the rates of other groups just to have the same representation, because they are able to remove the number of people who represent our communities, and that goes down to the distribution of resources, the allocation of educational resources, where they put hospitals at, etc. So we need to start taking these issues seriously, particularly on before the next election cycle, because if they're allowed to do this again in 2030, they might be a minority in this country come 2044, but they will still have an outsized level of power in our political system because they're able to draw the lines. We saw the exact same thing happen in South Africa toward the end of apartheid. We saw the same thing happen in Kosovo towards the dissolution of the Balkans in the 1990s. This is how minority groups maintain power against the will of the people in seemingly democratic systems.
Well, folks need to understand here, Rebecca, again, what this does is this also limits power. And when we say power, that means money. It means resources. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. And this is why the Republicans have been trying to get rid of Section 2. They weakened Section 4. This is why Clarence Thomas, who does not have the interests of black people at heart, wants to get rid of the Voting Rights Act completely. Without the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court would not have ruled in that favor in Alabama, in Louisiana, and we're seeing the impact of this. And so what Robert just laid out is political gerrymandering, where the Supreme Court said, "Hey, we got no fight in that. It's up to the states." But racial gerrymandering, they still have to deal with the courts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to be clear. I don't want any party, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, controlling how these lines are drawn, because we need these lines to be drawn in a way that's in the best interest of our community. And the best way to do that is through having a commission that's nonpartisan, that's adopting maps that have to be adopted by that state. And just like what Robert was saying, there are many real world impacts. I was just in Greensboro, North Carolina last Friday, speaking and meeting with different groups who are currently suing in North Carolina because of the voting omnibus that got passed by the North Carolina legislature, which also is being kicked into the courts with redrawing those congressional seats. So instead of having even remotely proportional congressional seats, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing people actually truly represented on both the federal level with congressional seats, but on the state level with state Senate and state House seats. And the real world implications, for example, we could look at in Georgia. When we look at public funding of HBCUs in Georgia, we see that Savannah State, we see that Albany State are among several universities that have been systematically underfunded by the state of Georgia. So we saw the Carlos Moore law firm now step in and do a lawsuit to try to do something about that. We also saw that in Maryland, and it took a particular lawsuit in order to get a better funding to these HBCUs. We're seeing these same issues even in Tennessee. And so we know and we can see where there's underfunding of resources that go into the Black community, that supports housing, that supports education, that even supports economic success in the Black community. And so it becomes very important to make sure that we have actual representation, because it's how we get dollars back home. We are all taxpayers. We are putting money into the system, but we're not proportionally getting money back and out of the system. The only way for that to happen is if we actually have representatives that are truly representing our interests.
And again, what Rebecca just laid out for the people, Robert, who are always yelling, "Oh, we ain't seeing this, we ain't seeing that," because a lot of that has to do with who's not representing you.
Exactly. And I tell people all the time, just think about it this way. Georgia is about to get another seat on the west side of Atlanta because of the court decision regarding the electoral, or regarding the map from 2020. Alabama, same thing. Florida, same thing. North Carolina, same thing. That's 4 seats already. It's a 217 to 212 majority for Republicans in the House of Representatives. That puts you right around 216. You take away George Santos' seat because he may be expelled from Congress and replaced by a Democrat. You get rid of Lauren Boebert's seat because you won that by about 600 votes in the last election. Boom, you have a Democratic majority. Speaker of the House, Hakeem Jeffries. Just like that. So it's not that these things don't matter. These things are crucially important, because if you have a Speaker of the House, Hakeem Jeffries, well, that means that now H.R. 40 is going to not only pass, but there'll be pressure on the United States Senate to actually pass a version of it, to have a study commission on reparations. That means that when we're talking about allocation of national resources, about whether or not the U.S. government, when they're putting R&D into MIT, into Stanford and other schools to do research for DARPA, well, now that can be done at Jackson State and FAM State and Clark Atlanta University. That means that when we're talking about where we're going to put military bases and then and the military industrial complex and contracting, etc., that can happen in Black communities as opposed to other communities, because you have the actual representation needed in those committees to push those things down. I got to sit down with with Charlie Rangel years ago when he was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. He explained just the power of having the gavel in those committees, the power of being able to set the agenda and to set the items that come before those committees. The American system is not built on the flash of the presidency. It's built on the bureaucracy of the House and of the Senate. And when in order to control those bureaucracies, you have to have control of the vote. And that's why it's so important that we fight to maintain and actually expand the voting right, to restore Section 4 and Section 5, to actually push forward legislation that will reform us to a 2024 version of the Voting Rights Act that would actually cover the entire nation and not just the 16 districts envisioned in 1965. There's work to be done going forward, but we have to stop the ball from rolling backwards. And there are groups out there that are fighting every minute of every day to roll us back.